Hi, everybody. I'm Cynthia Garrett, and welcome to the sessions. Now, joining me today is someone who's been here before, and I actually really have been excited to have him back again to check in on everything that's going on in his life and in his world. So by way of introduction, let's just start here. Benjamin Nolot is a filmmaker and an abolitionist committed to ending sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation around the world. Inspired by William Wilberforce, and as the founder and CEO of Exodus Cry, an international anti-trafficking organization that works in the areas of prevention, intervention, and restoration, Benjamin works to shift cultural mindsets and change laws that underpin sex trafficking. His mission is carried out through the production of hard-hitting documentaries and leading social activist campaigns. His films are incredible, they are powerful, they are transformative, and they are life-changing. He is the creator of Nefarious Merchant of Souls, which I have to say impacted an entire university campus when I first discovered Benjamin's work, whom I still call Benji. He also has a new film out, which is rocking the church to its core. It is called Raised on Porn. His documentary, Raised on Porn, is something that you will want to see, you don't want to miss seeing, and you will want to share, because this issue is one, I think, that is hidden and it's swept under a rug and veiled by shame. And the only way that we deal with anything and defeat anything is to actually speak up. We got to get it out in the open. We have to not be afraid to talk about it. And we have to actually let the enemy know that we'll not hide behind shame anymore. We will only go for our healing and our victory. So welcome, Benji. Can I call you Benji?
Of course. Thanks for having me on, Cynthia. This is my second time on, and the first time was around the last film that I released, which was Liberated for Netflix. And so it's good to come back and talk again with this newest film that we just released, Raised on Porn.
Yeah, Benji, first of all, I think for my audiences around the world who kind of might be new to you at this point, right? Why don't you share your journey of how, I mean, I look at you and I see this sort of like, wholesome, God-loving man, with a beautiful wife and daughters. And for you to be really and truly an activist in this world is so crazy to me. And it makes me ask the question, what's your journey to right here?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, for me, when I've thought about how did I get to this point of fighting trafficking and all this, it's been a bit of a circuitous path, but I also see like where there's been a thread in my life of different experiences and events that have kind of brought me to this point. And so I can elaborate on a little bit of that if it's helpful.
Yes, the floor is yours. I'm just going to kick back and listen.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I grew up as the youngest of four siblings. So I was a little bit sheltered kind of in my early childhood. And, but when I was 11 years old, I saw this movie called The Accused, which was about the gang rape.
Jodie Foster.
Yeah, played by Jodie Foster. And that movie awakened me to the knowledge of the presence of evil in the world at a young age and haunted me with the feeling that rape has to be the worst thing that could ever happen to a person. So I think that experience at 11 years old really kind of like marked me. And then it was the fact of, being raised by my two older sisters, my mom, my grandmother. There was an influence of women in my life, like from a young age. So I think I uniquely began to identify with the experiences of women. And so later, as I was in a season of just really seeking after God in a very consecrated season, I encountered this issue of human trafficking. And it really overwhelmed me. The first time that I heard about human trafficking was February 3rd, 2007. And just being awakened to the knowledge of the presence of slavery happening in a widespread way, not like one person over here that's been exploited, which is horrible, but this whole system of exploitation around the world was so overwhelming to me. And so it began as just a burden and something that, I prayed into, carried with me for a period of time, and began to eventually feel like I wanted to put feet to my prayers. And around that time, a lady approached me, said, "Look, I know you don't know me. My name's Gloria. God has told me to give you $10,000 to start an organization to fight human trafficking." And so that was like the catalyst moment to actually then take action in a more intentional way. But there's overlapping things, just my understanding of the world through the lens of my faith and what that looks like. There's a few threads here, but that in a nutshell, that's what brought me to get into this.
Well, I love that you say, rape is a horrible thing to happen to people. And you didn't say to women, because a lot of times I think the mistake is made that trafficking, sex trafficking, sexual abuse, that the victims are always women. And I think that has silenced a lot of men from coming forward and getting the help that they need. Is that true? Is that accurate?
Yeah, the human trafficking doesn't discriminate. It's a supply and demand issue. And so it affects boys and girls, it affects women and men. But what we do know is that the vast preponderance of victims are women and children, to the tune of 98%. And the vast majority of buyers are men, to the tune of 99%. So the primary perpetrators in this, whether the victims are male or female, the primary perpetrators are men. This is an issue of gender-based inequality and violence. So when we talk about the global commercial sex industry, there's a cover narrative that is used to conceal the harms of the sex industry and to advance its agenda of becoming normalized and legalized around the world. This cover narrative that's used, it really obscures the fact of what prostitution actually is, what the commercial sex industry really is. We hear terms like, this is liberating, this is empowering. We see OnlyFans mainstreaming prostitution around the world. We have our Instagram pages glorifying the glamour, the beauty of prostitution by putting images of hypersexualized, objectified women out there to lure them into the OnlyFans page or whatever it is. And so, but the truth is, the reality is that prostitution is a system of violence, exploitation, and gender inequality. That's what it is. And all of prostitution is a construct of male demand. And so it is, regardless of the venue of prostitution, it is men who are projecting and demanding their fantasies be met, whether that's behind a screen, whether that's in a brothel, whether that's on the street. And by virtue of that, those who are in the sex industry then become the repositories of all of men's offloaded existential guilt, shame, perversion, self-hatred, alienation, feelings of despair onto that person who has no choice but to receive it. So some of the most traumatized people in prostitution are those who are doing webcamming. Why? Because they're in a position now where men feel no sense of social barrier or shame in heavy projections of the most deviant, degrading, humiliating fantasies. I've spent years talking to these men. One of them said to me, I remember he said, my acting out is a way of making her pay for being a woman.
Right.
That's what he said. He said, my acting out is a way of making her pay for being a woman. So make no mistake about it. The cover narrative of the global commercial sex industry is a lie. It is, at a deep core level, the whole global commercial sex industry is a manifestation of internalized and realized misogyny. It is putting women in a position of a degraded, subjugated outhouse for all of men's offloaded perversion. And like I said before, so the people who are in it, they, regardless of how somebody got there, they experience it as a traumatic experience. PTSD is universal in prostitution.
Yeah.
And I'll pause there for a second, because I'm saying a lot. It's heavy what I'm saying. Sometimes I'm in this so much, I don't even realize how heavy some of these realities are. But
I'm sitting here, and when you're speaking, it's hard not to get completely drawn in, because you use a term like PTSD, and the world is not telling women, young or old, right? But the targets are get them when they're young. We know that. They're not telling the truth. The secular world is not telling the truth. You said it. They're glamorizing sex. They're, making it, it's the using of words, the twisting of words. It's empowering for a woman to do what she wants with her body. It's empowering to have an abortion if you don't want the baby. All of this stuff. I look at the way Satan twists the words so that before you know it, you're thinking that the thing that is evil is good, because the actual reality has been twisted. Look at, this generation uses the word flex. What's your flex? Well, that just means your boast. What are you boasting about? And the answer is, women, sex, drugs, whatever it is. Well, I think the deception here is that you're not listening to people say, hey, Benji, what do you want to boast about? What do you want to be anti-God about and boast? Because we know in the Bible, you're not supposed to boast or brag or, be prideful, but, but it's not called that. It's called flex. And flex isn't, well, that's not a bad thing, And so we sort of I think what we're witnessing is just a real deception to sell us these lies, to sell us the fact that these women who are in these industries, they're empowered. They're choosing to be there. I mean, I say this because I've had so many social media wars, with men, whenever I get dragged into the craziness of trying to speak to this issue with people, whenever we do a show, especially that talks about these issues and gets them out there, because men are really upset. They don't, how can you say that? The girls are happy to do this.
Right.
How is the lie sold to them?
Well, only a soulless generation would celebrate something like prostitution as an advancement in humanity. The reality is, like G.K. Chesterton said, he said that meaninglessness does not happen because we're weary of suffering. He said meaningless happens because we're weary of pleasure. And so make no mistake about it. We live in a planet that is rampant nihilism across the globe right now. It's the sex industry is robbing the soul of a generation. We were meant for authentic human connection and relationships. Yeah. The entirety of prostitution operates on the basis of a lack of authentic desire. Therefore, payment must be made. Yeah. So this goes back to the point of why people experience PTSD in the sex industry. The reason why is because they experience the sexual interaction, again, whether it's behind a screen or whether it's in a physical reality, they experience it as a form of sexual violation. Why? Because the sex is not desired. So here's the issue, is that sex and desire are inextricably linked. You cannot separate the two, because this is a part of our design in the constitution of our humanity. Sex and desire cannot be inextricably linked. And when you have sex without desire, you experience it as a form of violation, regardless of payment being made. So the payment is merely to bribe the women into silence against the crime that's happening against their body. Well, what women in prostitution talk about is having to compartmentalize and dissociate from the experience. So actually channel their self-worth, their humanity into a part of their body that they can keep out of the prostitution experience. So for some women, that's in their lips, and they'll say, you know, I don't kiss, or it might be the caressing of an arm, or so they can compartmentalize and dissociate their humanity into that part, let their body experience the humiliating, degrading experience of prostitution, which is a violation of their humanity and a betrayal of their self, often coerced by a pimp or a third, party trafficker. So it's a coerced complicity into self-betrayal that violates their body and leaves them with PTSD. And then the third party gatekeepers of the industry, traffickers and billionaires whose names I won't mention and so forth, then put out propaganda to create a cover narrative about prostitution, to sell us the lie that this is somehow empowering, this is somehow liberating, this is somehow normal. And unfortunately, we live in a day and in an age where, because of technology, because of the widespread proliferation and normalization of pornography, that the sex industry is exploding around the globe. As I said before, it is prostituting the sexuality of a generation, and it is robbing us of our humanity, the privilege to, as a man, to take the risk and vulnerability of pursuing a real relationship that actually requires something of me, rather than just going and paying somebody to spread their legs. And on the other side of the equation, it's putting women into the position of container, sponge, receptacle, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. And so prostitution exists because of all these social facilitating and lubricating factors that have brought us to this point. The one that we are currently really focusing on is the aspect of pornography and the role that it plays in all of this in our world. So hence the film we just released, Raised on Porn.
Yeah. And as we kind of move into that, because I see a through line here, when you start at sex trafficking, which was basically Nefarious, your first film, and then your second film, Liberated, was interesting to me because you went to the youth culture. And I found that to be very, very, even the title of the film, Liberated, the youth culture has been sold lock, stock, and barrel, that they are free. They are, and on spring break, which is what the film deals with, they are free to have sex. It's anonymous. It's non-committal. It's all of these things. And then at the end of the film, you actually realize that even those participating in it are completely being destroyed by it. And so before we get to Raised on Porn, which I think I have an interesting question about what's happened because of COVID for you for that. But can you just talk a little bit about Liberated and why you think that this movement, because I do think it's a movement, all of this sexual perversion industry, I believe is at a real crossroads on our planet. I believe that God is lifting up and blessing people like yourself in the battle against this, because you put yourself on the front line to go after this on all of our behalf. And I also believe that the enemy's really mad. And I think that a lot of what we see politically, that's a smokescreen and a distraction today. Racism, wokeness, social justice movement. Social justice. Don't you love that word? There's no justice in the social justice movement of today when things like this exist. I think they're all distractions, really and truly, to keep us from paying attention to the fact that a lot of billionaires, you just said it, a lot of very powerful people, politicians, leaders, they are invested in being able to have everything they want in this world. And once you've been given power and money and position, usually the only thing left to feed of your flesh is your sexual deviance. And I think that basically the exposing of this sexual deviance is at the tip of the pyramid of real bad stuff that we really are moving into, hopefully battling. So why are they going after the youth culture? Why the youth culture?
Yeah, there's so many layers to this to unpack. I mean, we could literally unpack this for days. So I think in this conversation, I'm trying to find the words to create the most brief framework for us to just think about this at a macro level. So I want to say, first of all, that let's put human sexuality in its proper place. Human sexuality is something that none of us get out of. All of us were born with a sex drive, in Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. So there was something ingrained into our humanity in which we desire for sexual intimacy and connection with other human beings. That is something that human sexuality is something that is beautiful and should be spoken about with reverence and viewed with respect to its power, its potency, its potential for human connection and to preserve a relationship and a family structure. And so I think oftentimes when people hear us critique the sex industry or critique pornography, they think, oh, these are sexual prudes, these people. And that's not really the case. It's actually the opposite. It's the very fact that we have a value for something that we're fighting for its protection, the beauty of something. So in my view, I see evil as simply this: the corruption of the sacred. Think about when you hear a story of a priest who has abused a child. Here is somebody who is in a position of the cloth, who has consecrated himself to live a life devoted to the service of God and to serve the weak and the vulnerable in society. And he uses that as an occasion to exploit the vulnerable. Like we see that situation, we understand this is nothing short of pure evil. And so what we see happening right now around the world pertaining to our sexuality is simply the corruption of the sacred. It is evil. It is quite simply evil. And in to the year 2002, I believe it was, I had a dream. And in this dream, I was given an insight, without going into all the details of the dream, I was given an insight into the strategy of Satan in this generation. And what I saw in this dream is the deployment of these forces of darkness to harvest and colonize the sexuality of a generation, to release unprecedented darkness on the planet, and to crush the family. And so, I didn't have a lot of revelation at the time about what that looked like, what that meant, but I saw it so clearly in this dream. Well, in later that year, I think it was around the same time, I had this little group down in Southern California called Spirit Seekers. And we had decided to go out and to start praying around some of these places like strip clubs and things of that nature, and just praying for God to meet these people in the midst of all of this, so I gave a message in which I spoke about the calling of Jehu to eradicate the influence of Jezebel in the land, which was an influence of spreading sexual immorality, the corruption of the sacredness of human sexuality. And the very next day, a prophetic man called me up on the phone, and he says, look, I've been given a dream. I saw Jezebel over California, and I feel like I'm on this Jehu assignment, and I feel like God's inviting you to come up into my chariot with me to join me in mobilizing California to go after this. So that was literally the next day. So I began to feel a sense of calling in this space of really trying to stand in the gap in intercession and through messaging to address the culture of hypersexuality and objectification. But again, at the time, I didn't know the full scope of what that would mean. So coming back to February 3rd, 2007, is when I discovered the issue of human trafficking for the first time. Well, I've been praying for years for the mantle of Wilberforce without even knowing who Wilberforce was, because this prophetic man would always pray for the mantle of Wilberforce. So then after that moment, February 3rd, 2007, this lady, I gone up to a church in Northern California, we're meeting with the leaders, and everyone was saying, there was a trafficking of survivor of human trafficking. Everyone was saying happy birthday to her. So I said, happy birthday. She said, no, happy birthday to you. And I was like, mine's actually in November, and she goes, no. She goes, I heard you give a message once and I never forgot it. She goes, she said, on February 3rd, 2007, you heard about human trafficking for the first time. She said on February 3rd, 2007, she goes, I was in jail because I wouldn't testify against my trafficker. She goes, and I got down on my knees and I prayed that for my gift that year, that God would raise somebody up who would expose this evil injustice. So February 3rd, 2007, this survivor of trafficking is in prison. She gets on her knees. She prays, God, raise somebody up to expose this evil injustice. February 3rd, 2007, I'm, however many thousands of miles away, become introduced to the issue of human trafficking. It pierces me, redirects the entire course of my life. And 2 weeks later, a movie comes out called Amazing Grace about the life of William Wilberforce. And God speaks to my heart and says, I am raising up a Wilberforce movement to a new movement of freedom to challenge the system of slavery and oppression around the world. And so when I look at the way at a macro level that the spiritual forces are taking shape in the planet, the way that the assault against our sexuality, and I consider my own calling in the middle of this, like I'm very sober and aware that God is moving to challenge this trend, to challenge these forces of darkness, to challenge the hijacking of our sexuality. And so now for 15 years, we've been on that journey at Exodus Cry, and we have a whole movement that's fighting with us in it. And we feel sober and humble, but also very emboldened at this moment, especially considering the impact of all of this on children, and as you said, on young adults. And so, we can keep teasing this out, but I wanted just to give a little bit of that backdrop to see that, yeah, there's some really awful things taking shape in our planet, but God,
hope.
but God. It's like when, you, I'm sure got a glimpse of the Jesus movement. You were pretty young then, but it was like, for all intents and purposes, people would look at that generation and say it's a hopeless generation. These people are strung out of their minds, like they're completely lost. But God looked down on that generation. He saw something, and he saw the potential to pour out something stronger than the rebellion that would fascinate their hearts with the truth of what they were created for, that all that seeking would be found in the person of Jesus, that they would be liberated and set free from, using sex and drugs to satiate or try to find meaning in their lives, and discover their true identity as sons and daughters, where, so I feel confident that God's moving in the midst of all that we see happening around us. And I'm encouraged by that.
I think all that we see happening around us may actually have to have gotten to this point where we see it enough to call on God. It's often, as I think people, when we come to the end of ourselves, God can finally begin, because we get out of the way and we realize how broken and desperate we are. But we're going to wrap for this week because we're out of time for this week's session, but we're going to pick up next week with this powerful conversation. And we're going to move into pornography, which I think is the secret, silent sort of thing that sits right in the heart, at the heart of this issue, feeding and nurturing and going after the youth in a way that I never knew was taking place before your documentary Raised on Porn. I'm Cynthia Garrett. You've been a part of another session. We will be back next week with Benjamin Nolot. Don't go anywhere.